All right, everyone, this is a recording about characteristics of nonverbal communication in chapter 6 of your textbook. So the whole chapter deals with nonverbal communication. This video is going to talk about the sorts of things that kind of define what nonverbal communication is. So the first thing to talk about is the fact that nonverbal communication has communicative value. Up to this point, we've been talking about the role of verbal communication. We've been talking about the fact that communication has meaning, and that meaning can be found in the words, not in the words, but in the people themselves, and then how we interpret the meaning of those words to us. There are denotative meanings of words, but really what we're talking about is the functioning of the connotative meaning of words. Well, nonverbal communication is basically the same, but the fact that a lot of times people misconstrue the fact that when you are not doing anything nonverbally and you're not saying anything verbally, that you're not communicating. And what communication theorists actually have found is that we cannot not communicate. So in other words, we're always going to communicate something through our nonverbal action, even when we don't feel like we're doing something nonverbally. The example I give you is in a live face-to-face class. If I ask students in class a question and they don't respond, and they look at me or they look down at the table or look up at the ceiling or wherever they want to look, the question is, are they communicating something? And the fact is that they are communicating something. Now, the risk that they run is that I might interpret that lack of actual nonverbal cues to be something other than what they intended. So what are some of the things that might cross my mind when I see that happen? I think, well, they didn't understand the question, or I could think that they didn't do the reading, or I could think that they weren't paying attention. Well, those are just three things. There's a whole variety of things that might be interpreted from my standpoint as the receiver. Remember, I'm decoding that nonverbal cue, and it's going to always communicate something to me. What that is might be different from what you intended. So we always interpret some sort of message from a nonverbal cue. And this is why communication theorists say we cannot not communicate. Even our best intentions not to respond and do anything still communicates a message. All right, nonverbal communication is also relational. And in that sense, it means that the relationship you have with the person oftentimes defines the meaning of those nonverbal cues. So we use it also for identity management. So if we are trying to impress somebody who's a potential employer and that interviewer, we portray ourselves in a particular way that makes us hopefully more hireable, right? We dress a particular way for a reason. Everybody knows that you go to an interview, you want to dress nicely, right? Because you're dressing to impress the person. You might not normally dress that way. And so again, we talked about identity management earlier in the semester, and this is another way that we use nonverbal communication to do that as well. So not just the way we talk and the language that we use that creates an identity, but also the way we look and the way that we present ourselves. And it defines relationships. Like I mentioned, that dynamics in a relationship. Sometimes you have different things that you have between you and a person you have an intimate relationship with or a close relationship with, that same nonverbal cue might mean nothing in a different relationship where you barely know the person. And then also, it's important to think about the idea that the truer sense of emotion that a person expresses can be found in the nonverbal cues more than in the verbal cues. So if you saw someone, a friend, right, and you said, how are you doing? And they say, well, I guess I'm doing okay, right? Now, the verbal message says, hey, I'm doing okay, right? If we took that at face value, we'd be like, okay, great. But the tone of their voice, right, we refer to as paralanguage, says otherwise, right? If we have emotional intelligence as part of communication competence, we're able to say, hey, doesn't sound like everything's okay. Are you sure everything's all right? Right? The truer indication of emotion is indicated in the nonverbal cue. Okay. Also, nonverbal communication tends to be more ambiguous than verbal communication. Sometimes it's hard to tell and read nonverbal cues, and especially when it comes to meaning, a nonverbal cue might have couple of different meanings, right? Like the example I gave you in the classroom, when students don't respond, they just stare at me. That could mean several things, right? So the context is important. We've talked about the nature of context in spoken language. It's no different in nonverbal communication. The history of the relationship also plays an impact on how nonverbal cues are interpreted. So again, if you have someone who's you're in an intimate relationship or a close relationship with, you can probably read the nonverbal cues, right? If you know someone really well and what they mean versus someone else that you don't know as well, those same nonverbal cues might not be what you think they are. And mood is also something that that affects the way that we interpret nonverbal communication, right? So part of emotional intelligence is not only being able to identify the way that someone says something non-verbally, but also in yourself, right? And the fact that if you think about someone who's had a bad day, their nonverbals are probably going to be indicating that, you know, they had a bad day, and that might affect the way that they communicate back to you. Or when you're not having a great day, right, and you have things running through your head, that might affect the way that you communicate with other people as well. So in this case, because nonverbal communication tends to be more ambiguous, perception checking, that you learned that earlier in one of the previous chapters, perception checking is just as important with nonverbal cues as they are with verbal messages. All right. Two more things as far as characteristics of nonverbal communication. One is that nonverbal communication is different from verbal communication, obviously. We tend to be more purposeful with verbal communication, whereas with nonverbal communication, we sometimes give off nonverbal cues that we don't even realize we're doing. You know, when we react to somebody saying something or doing something, we kind of reflexively respond, right? And that's not always thought out. So we might not even realize we're doing something non-verbally that communicates a message to someone. And so I see this a lot in my public speaking class because we record the speeches and students watch them to do self-evaluations. And one of the things they pick up on is the nonverbal cues that they didn't realize that they did while they were speaking. Things like moving around a lot or fidgeting. During the speech, they don't realize they do that. Later, they watch the video, they notice those sorts of things, right? So a lot of times we send off messages that aren't intended, and we have to be aware of that. The last thing is nonverbal skills are important, right? It's important to be able to recognize and understand and interpret nonverbal cues. There's research done that says that it leads to things like it's a strong indicator of popularity, attractiveness, social economic well-being. And again, as I've mentioned, it's a part of emotional intelligence, which is part of that what tool that you're putting in the communication competence toolbox, if you remember that analogy from early on in the semester. So it's not only about recognizing the emotion in other people, but it's also recognizing the emotion in ourselves and the effect that has on the ability to communicate effectively. Remember, we're trying to create shared meaning, and nonverbal communication plays a big part in that as well. All right, so that's our discussion about the characteristics of nonverbal communication. Hopefully you understand a little bit about the nature of nonverbal communication.